Now, before I get started, I want to say that we had several people ask about if they could get a blanket like Nancy has. So just see us afterwards. It may be a fundraiser. We can sell blankets. No, I'm definitely just kidding about that. Imagine that you're at home, you're asleep in your bed, and you hear a little commotion, and you know there's some unrest in the community going on at the time. But you hear the front doors of your house being crashed in, broken into, that house is being breached. You hear the voices, the yelling of grown men as they come into your house. And your bedroom door flings open, and with guns drawn, they tell you to get down on the floor. And you get down, you're terrified. And they finally get you up and take you out into the living room, and there they've got your mother and your dad and your sister there, and all of you are there, and as you can imagine, just terrified of what's going on. And a soldier with a mask on finally just says, "You take him," pointing at you, and to the others it says, "Tie them up." And they drag you from the house, and as you're taken outside to hearing the screams of your mother, as you go outside and are gathered there in the street, you notice that there's a lot of other young men out there. And if it might possibly be any comfort, you recognize that there are several that you know. And then they begin to take you away. And as you walk away and hearing the screams and the calls from your mom and dad and your sister crying, you're led away, and you never know what's going to happen. If you're going to be brought back home, what's going to happen to your family, and you're taken away. If you can imagine that little bit of a scenario, then you can imagine what it would have been like for Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, better as we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when their country was overrun by Babylon. And they come in and conquer your town, your country, your city, and where you live. And they gather up some to carry off as servants, others as slaves, some executed. Last week we began a series from the book of Daniel we're calling the Daniel Dilemma. A dilemma is a difficult choice between at least two options. Excuse me. And you know whichever one you choose, there are going to be some unpleasant circumstances that go along with it. No matter which one you choose, life is going to be difficult. This dilemma that we're going to find Daniel and the others in a number of times are not like some of the dilemmas that we face that we would call a dilemma. I can't decide whether to choose chicken or steak. That's not a dilemma. Daniel, they had life and death choices. Choices that had to be made that would determine whether they lived or how they would live. And I'm so excited about this study and about these young men that we get to study because they're such role models for us. They're such an encouragement for us because they were living in an anti-God culture. But yet they found a way to remain faithful to God, but also very effective and a positive factor in the communities in which they lived. Now, after they became captives, and this was a common practice of conquering nations, and they took the best of the best, you might want to try to say, back to their capital. They entered into a 3-year training where they learned the language, the ways of the Babylonian people, and it was two things: to learn new things and to erase the things of the past, to form a new allegiance to a new king and kingdom. And if they had to walk all over your God to do that, then so be it. And at the end of the 3 years, the king interviewed these young men. And it says, if you read there in Daniel 1, it says that when he interviewed them, and it wasn't just them, we assumed that were other candidates from Jerusalem, other candidates from other countries. It says that none of the others were quite like them. They stood head and shoulders above the other, and they entered into the king's service. Look at Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And we're going to spend all of our time right there in Daniel 3. So if you want to turn there, and it's going to be on the screen as well. But Daniel 3, 1 and 2 begins, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to this dedication of the image he had set up. This was a huge statue, 90 feet. 90 feet, that's huge. You couldn't miss it. It was a huge deal because they invited all of the dignitaries, all of the representatives. And the only thing bigger than that statue and the event was the ego of King Nebuchadnezzar. Because you're going to see this is what it comes down to. Keep reading in Daniel 3, verse 4 says this. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." And in verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Several things just to think of right off the top. It was for all people. He was saying, I don't care who you are, where you came from, what language you speak. This is what you're to do. And most likely, the blazing furnace was not just a furnace that would heat a building or something like that. It was most likely a pagan offering site that you would be thrown into the fire as a sacrifice to their gods. This is the second challenge of culture that we find Daniel and the others involved in. Last week was during their time of training. This one is once they have begun work for the king. And the challenge is who you can worship. Who you can worship. Ralph Waldo Emerson said this, "That which dominates our imagines and our thoughts will determine our lives and our character. Therefore, it behooves us." We don't say behooves. Nobody says that to me anymore. Behooves means it is our responsibility. It is our duty. In other words, therefore, it is our duty to be careful what we worship. For what we are worshiping, we are becoming. Culture will always give us something to worship. Culture will always give us a choice to make, something new to bow down to, something to give our allegiance to. It will not only offer choices, eventually it will promote one over another. And eventually, no matter what culture it is, it will demand our allegiance to one thing or another as most important. For the Christian, the word worship is something that is a well-known word. We probably use that word every week of our life. Worship is not always understood for what we think it is. Worship is either public, just like we are here today. We're a public gathering to worship God. But it can also be private worship. And to be honest, it is the private worship that leads us to public worship. If we do not worship God privately, we're not motivated to worship Him publicly. Worship puts things in the rightful place. It puts things in the right order. And if worship brings a balance to life, and that's what we talked about last week, is just finding the balance in life. When we don't worship God, we eventually will get out of balance. And if you've went through one of those periods or journeys or valleys of your life where you didn't worship God privately or publicly, you know that you lose your peace, your direction, you lose your joy. Last week we saw the first challenge presented to Daniel and the others was to confuse their identities. When they first arrived in Babylon, they gave them new names. The names that reflected God and their culture of the past were removed, and the names mirrored or represented the new gods they had, or they even confused their gender. Some of the names had a feminine characteristic to them. That was what they faced. Their roots were challenged. Their foundations were being torn down. The lines were blurred. Eventually, challenges from culture to us will lead us to a subtle blending or bending of our values. The same is true of worship. Now, here we go. This is my 1-point sermon for the day. 1 point. Never enough, never satisfied. Our culture will never say it's enough. Our culture will never be satisfied with us. King Nebuchadnezzar had it all. He was the most powerful man on the planet Earth. He had everything. The most powerful armies, the most luxurious surroundings. He had everything. But it wasn't enough. I must make it at my fingertips. When I decide to blow the trumpet, play the instruments, people must fall down and worship me. Worship the image that I create. A man who has everything in the world and says, yet I want to control when, where, and who my people worship. That's the way it'll always be. Culture will never say enough. For example, and this is just one I'm using as an example. We can choose from dozens. If we look at the history of abortion in America, 1972, Supreme Court decision, it was legalized. You know how I feel about abortion, that I'm not in favor of it. Excuse me. But then it was legalized, and it was left a choice. A woman could pursue that as an option in pregnancy. But it wasn't enough. It's assumed that that must be supported by the government in the sense of taxpayer dollars. But that wasn't enough. We must pass more laws that protect it and make it more readily available. But that wasn't enough. It must be protected by more and more laws. It must not be viewed as it was in the 70s, 80s, that it was an option, a last-ditch option to pregnancy. But now it must be celebrated. It must not be a choice, it must be a basic human right. And now, that even wasn't enough. If someone disagrees, no matter with how much grace and truth, they must be canceled. They must not have the right to speak in public about anything. It's never enough. No matter, you take any of the cultural issues that we have faced in the last 20 years, and it is the same progression. It will never be enough of what the culture asks of us. It will always ask, demand more. Culture never brings a balance to life. It always brings imbalance. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were great citizens, servants of the king. But that was never going to be enough. That just wasn't going to be enough. They had to demand something else. There was always going to be another challenge. And it wasn't long till somebody pointed out, these young men will not bow. Daniel 3 verse 12 says, somebody reported, said, but there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. They're clumped into, they took good servants of the king, but clumped them all together and said, they don't even listen to you. It was all or nothing to the culture. You must accept everything that our culture accepts. And he calls them in, which I think is a show of respect for these young men because anybody else, they would just kill them, throw them in the fire. But he brings them in and he says, guys, you understand what the law is. You understand that I will kill you. You understand what you're supposed to do. And this was their answer in Daniel 3:16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Have you ever been present in a very uncomfortable, awkward situation? I can't imagine a time when it would have been more awkward than when these young men said to the king of all the known world, we're not going to obey you. I can imagine being a soldier standing there and the place just held their breath. And somebody went, oh snap, it's about to get bad in here. Worship is the response to what you value most. That's why they wouldn't bow down. That's why the fire and death was more preferable than bowing down to something that they did not value as a God. I read this past week, a scholar, a writer said that if you look through history and all through the Bible, that three false gods keep showing up. Three Old Testament gods. The god of Mammon, which is money and riches. The god of Baal, which is of power and pride. And Asherah is the god of pleasure. These are present all through history, whether we call them those things or not. You go to the Garden of Eden and you reread how the serpent tempted Eve. These were the things or elements of these. You go to the wilderness where Jesus was tempted for the 40 days. These are the elements that were there. There's always going to be a pull, someone trying to push us away from our God. That's always never going to be satisfied, never say it's enough, that will always want more from us. Why wouldn't these three men, three young followers of God, bow down? Why couldn't they just say, and I'm sure there was somebody that said, just bow down. You don't have to mean it. You can still love your God. Just do it. We talked about this last week. There's a difference between what we say we believe and what our convictions are. And that's what will get us through these tough cultural times. Our convictions is where we draw the line in the sand and say, I disagree. I'm not going to do that. I'll lose my job. I'll lose this relationship. I'll lose my life, but I'm not going to do this. No bowing. Don't you wish all of our battles were as obvious as a 90-foot tall gold statue? You say, oh, that's trouble. But they're not. They're much more subtle. They're much more on a daily basis. They're wrapped so innocently so many times of, hey, this is a good choice. Make this choice for you and your family. That's why we have to be so diligent. We have to continuously be on our guard. Fathers and mothers and husbands and wives, that we have to be on guard that many of the things that culture is offering us will push a wedge between us and God. Jesus, when he sent his disciples out in the groups of two, remember, to go out and to teach and to preach and to heal. One of the pieces of advice he gave them, Matthew 10:16. He said, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And what Jesus is saying, keep your intentions pure. remain pure to the goal and the mission, but you be on your toes. You pay attention. You don't swallow everything hook, line, and sinker. You think it through. Don't get tricked. Don't get pulled in. Don't get knocked off the track. You be smart. And that's what Jesus was saying to them, and it says to us from the beginning to end of the Bible, you got to be vigilant. You got to be watching what is taking place. And this is one of the most powerful statements that's ever been made to center a Christian's life in core convictions when it said, but even if he does not, we want you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. That is the defining place in a person's life. Most, if not all of us, are aware now of a young man by the name of Damar Hamlin. He is a player for the National Football League's Buffalo Bills. In a nationally televised game this past Monday night, the Bills were playing the Cincinnati Bengals. And early in that game, on a seemingly uneventful tackle, Damar Hamlin got up from the tackle, just seemingly unhurt, but in a second collapsed right to the ground. And the medical staff came out and the players kind of gathered around, and they'd seen this type of thing many, many times, but within moments of the medical staff, the trainers from the sidelines getting to him, they realized that he wasn't hurt. This 24-year-old athlete's heart had stopped. He was not breathing. And on national television, and 60,000 plus people watching, and two teams watching this take place, they began to work on this young man to try to restart his heart. If you don't think a place of 60,000 people can be quiet, it can. And you began to see things happen. The raw emotions of these football warriors began to pour out. And they began to cry. And they began to kneel down. They began to hug each other. And as they loaded him up onto an ambulance, something happened. The teams knelt to pray. What our culture, what laws and court battles have fought that says no praying on the football field, you couldn't stop them from praying. There was no force on this earth that could stop them from praying. I watched as they made the announcement, the game has been postponed. And the people filed from that stadium. The players walked to the locker rooms. Coaches said, we do not need to be playing. We need to be at the hospital to be with our brother. I watched on television as they switched to the hospital itself. Fans from both teams, from both cities, had walked to the hospital and set up prayer vigils around that hospital to pray for this young man. By the next morning, every news outlet in the country was carrying the Damar Hamlin story. There was billboards, everything that popped up. Pray for Damar, number 3. And I saw something that I'm not sure I would ever think I'd see. On a live ESPN broadcast, one of the announcers said, you know, the whole nation's praying. I think we should too. And they bowed their heads and prayed to God on national television. I got to be honest with you. I prayed. I prayed for that young man. I didn't want his life to end like that or him to be crippled. Or I got to be real honest with you. I didn't just pray for him. I prayed for the prayer. What I mean is this. I just was pouring my heart out to God. I said, God, I've never in my lifetime seen a nation just stop in the midst of all the bickering and arguing and everything we've done and pray like they're doing. And I just selfishly telling God what he needs to do. I said, God, please heal this man and let everybody see how wonderful you are. But yet, I knew if God in his wisdom did not heal that young man, I knew I was still going to worship God. I knew that God was still going to be God. And that did not make God not a good God. I knew that's who I would continue to follow. But I knew that's what I wanted. Back in Babylon, the king was true to his word. Infuriated by their disobedience, arrogance, what he would see as arrogance, he had them thrown into the fire. And he made the statement as he said, did we not throw 3 into the fire? Why do I see 4 standing in the flames? One who looks like a god or an angel. And he called for them to come out. And it says they came out of the fire and they weren't even singed. I'd say it didn't even smell like smoke. And this is what the most powerful man in the world was brought to say in response to this. Daniel 3:28 says this. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. What an awesome story. What an awesome series of events. What awesome faith by these young men. What awesome inspiration for us. You know, the victory was won not when they walked from the flames, but when they said we would rather go to the flames than bow down to anyone but our God. That's when the victory was. Damar Hamlin appears to be that he's going to make a full recovery. Each day, each hour, he's getting a little stronger, beginning to speak and do some things. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't know what this nation will do. I don't know if that will just be a blip on the radar screen, that they came together and prayed. And for a week, we kind of put a lot of things aside and focused on one thing together. I don't know. I don't control that. But we control what we can do from this point forward. We can control if we make the decision, I bow down no longer to the culture and what it calls me to do. I bow down to God and I worship him and him alone. And no one can tell me I can't. That's a decision that we can make. Then we'll see a great difference, just like Nebuchadnezzar made the claim that he is God, that their God is the greatest of all.